Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Positive Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Parmis Najmi, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you want to listen to more episodes like this one on self-improvement, mindset, and wellness, go ahead and hit that follow button to join the family. Before I get into today's episode, I just want to ask you guys for a quick and kind favor, and that is if you haven't yet left a review, I would absolutely appreciate if you could do so. It helps so much to build this podcast and help it grow so that we can increase the positive impact we make and just overall make it a bigger community. Also, if you are looking for daily motivation, follow me on Instagram at Positive Proof Podcast, where I post daily quotes that serve as sweet daily reminders. And if anyone is wondering how to leave episode requests, you can actually send me your thoughts via the DM Your Thoughts link in the description or via Instagram DM as well, or you can leave a comment if you're tuning in on Spotify. Now, if you're new here, a quick little intro about me is I am 27 years old, based in Toronto, and I started this podcast after a few big life shifts from leaving my 9-to-5, going full-time on a business with my boyfriend, and just realizing I had way too much to say about self-growth, relationships, and becoming the woman that I actually want to be. So I'm really happy you're here. And with that, let's get into today's episode. Now, today's episode is about something that I think a lot of us are guilty of, myself included, and that is consuming a lot of self-improvement content without actually applying it to our lives. Because we live in a time where information is literally everywhere. You can open your phone and instantly find advice on productivity, discipline, fitness, business, relationships, mindset, literally anything you want to improve in your life. And in many ways, that's an amazing thing. You know, we have access to so much knowledge that previous generations simply didn't have. But the downside of this is that sometimes we start confusing learning with progress. We listen to podcasts, we watch motivational videos, we read books about habits, we save TikToks about discipline, and all of those things can make us feel like we're actively working on ourselves. But if we're being honest, sometimes we're just consuming more and more information without actually changing anything in our day-to-day lives. And there's a quote I recently came across that explains this idea perfectly. It says, "It's very, very hard to get good at swimming without swimming. It's very hard to get good at cooking by watching unlimited content about cooking and reading cooking books. You must cook. We have to go to the field and do." And when I heard that, it really stuck with me because it's such a simple idea, but it applies to almost everything in life. You can watch 100 videos about fitness, but you still have to go to the gym. You can listen to podcasts about confidence all you want, but you still have to put yourself in situations that challenge you. You can read books about discipline, but you still have to follow through on the promises that you make to yourself. At some point, the learning has to turn into doing. So in today's episode, I want to talk about the habits of less consuming and more doing. Why it's so easy to fall into the trap of constantly consuming self-improvement content, and why that can sometimes keep us stuck, and how shifting toward action can completely change the way we grow. Quick poll check-in though, for those of you who are tuning in on Spotify, I want you guys to answer honestly. And the question is, do you feel like you spend more time consuming self-improvement content or actually applying it to your life? No judgment at all. I'm genuinely curious to see where everyone falls on the spectrum. So go ahead and vote in the poll, and then let's get into the first point. So let's start with something I've been noticing a lot lately, both in myself and in the world around me. And that is how easy it has become to consume self-improvement content without actually improving our lives. It is a self-improvement consumption trap. So as I said earlier, we are living in a time where information is everywhere. And on the surface, this all seems like a really good thing because we're learning, right? We're educating ourselves. We are becoming more aware. But at some point, I started to ask myself a slightly uncomfortable question. Are we actually improving, or are we just consuming content about improvement? Because there's a big difference between the two, okay? And I say this with full self-awareness because, first of all, I am someone who loves self-development, okay? Obviously, I host a podcast about it. And I enjoy learning about psychology, mindset, productivity, all of it. But I've also caught myself falling into this loop where I'm constantly absorbing information without necessarily applying it. You listen to one podcast episode, then another one starts automatically. You watch a video about building discipline, then another one about habits, and then another one about morning routines. And by the end of it, you feel like you've done something productive. You feel inspired, you feel motivated, maybe even a little bit wiser. But your life hasn't actually changed. You still didn't start the thing that you said you were going to start. You didn't take the action you've been putting off. You didn't make the uncomfortable move that growth usually requires. And this is where the trap lies, because consuming self-improvement content feels productive, even when it's not. It gives us the illusion of progress. Your brain thinks, I'm working on myself right now. I'm learning something valuable. And technically that's true, but learning and applying are two completely different things. Think about it like this. Watching a video about starting a business is not the same thing as actually starting one. The transformation happens in the action, not in the information. And the tricky part is that consuming information is just so much easier because it's comfortable. It's low risk and there's no chance of embarrassment or failure when you're just sitting there listening or watching. You can feel like you're moving forward without ever having to step into that uncomfortable space where growth actually lives. And I've even noticed how normalized this has become in our culture. People will say things like, I've listened to so many podcasts about this, or I've read so many books about productivity, and yet they still feel stuck. And it's not because the information isn't good. There's amazing knowledge out there. The problem is that knowledge without action doesn't really change anything. It's kind of like watching sports videos all day, but never actually stepping onto the field to take a few shots. At some point, you have to stop watching and start practicing. And I think what's interesting is that sometimes we don't even realize we're doing this. We convince ourselves that we're preparing, and we say things like, I just need to learn a little bit more first, or let me watch one more video so I can really understand it. But often that's just our brain trying to stay in a safe place, because once you actually start doing something, you open the door to mistakes, to criticism, to uncertainty. Consuming information protects you from all of that, but action doesn't. And so I really want to emphasize that this episode is not about saying learning is bad. Learning is incredible. It's one of the best things you can do for yourself. But the problem happens when learning becomes a substitute for action instead of a tool that supports it. Because self-improvement content was never meant to be the destination. It was meant to be the starting point. The podcast, the book, the video, the advice, those things are supposed to spark something inside of you. They're supposed to give you ideas, perspective, maybe even the courage to try something new. But the real work begins when you close the app, put the phone down, and actually start applying what you've learned. And that's the shift I want us to start thinking about today, because this is the most important part, is realizing this and becoming self-aware enough to know that, okay, that's enough, time to start doing. So we need to start asking ourselves, what am I actually doing with the things that I'm learning? Because at the end of the day, the people who truly change their lives are not the ones who consume the most information. They're the ones who take action on it. Moving on to point number 2, the second thing I want to talk about is the fact that overconsumption creates mental clutter. And this is something I've personally experienced many times. Consuming too much advice can actually make you more confused instead of more clear. Because one of the biggest problems with constantly consuming self-improvement content is that eventually you start hearing too many perspectives, especially in today's day and age. And at first, that seems like a good thing. It feels like you're becoming well-rounded. You're learning from different people, different experiences, different philosophies. But after a while, something interesting starts to happen. You start hearing completely opposite advice. How fun. One podcast says the key to success is waking up at 5 a.m, and another one says sleep is the most important thing and you should stop glorifying early mornings. One person says you should start a business and work for yourself, and another says entrepreneurship is overrated and stability is a smarter path. One person tells you follow your passions no matter what, and another says passion is unreliable and discipline is what matters. It gets very exhausting. And suddenly you're sitting there thinking, what am I actually supposed to do? Because every person online sounds confident. Everyone presents their advice like it's the formula, the only formula. Like they've just cracked down the code, and if you just follow these 5 steps, your life will completely transform. But the reality is that most of these people are simply sharing what worked for them. their personality, their circumstance, their opportunities, their strengths. All of those things shaped the path that they took. And when you consume too many of these perspectives without actually taking action yourself, you can end up in a weird mental space where you're constantly analyzing every possible approach. You start second guessing everything. And you start to think, maybe I should try this strategy. But then you remember another video that said that strategy doesn't work. And then you think, okay, maybe I should do it this way then. But then you remember a podcast episode that said that approach is outdated. So instead of making a decision and moving forward, you stay stuck in this endless loop of overthinking. I have been here way too many times, and I know you have too. And I think a lot of people today are experiencing this without even realizing it, because the internet gives us access to more opinions than any generation before us. At any moment, you can open your phone and hear thousands of different viewpoints about how you should live your life, structure your career, build your relationships, or spend your time. But too many opinions can create mental clutter, and we don't want that. It's kind of like trying to cook dinner while 50 people are standing in the kitchen, all giving you different instructions at the very same time. One person is telling you to add more salt. Another says don't add salt at all. Someone else says you should start over and cook a completely different dish. And eventually you're just standing there overwhelmed. And the funny thing is that clarity rarely comes from hearing more opinions. In most cases, clarity comes from experience. It comes from trying something and seeing how it feels, and noticing what works for you, noticing what doesn't, and adjusting as you go. But when you're constantly consuming more and more content, you sometimes delay that process because you are waiting to hear the perfect piece of advice that will remove all uncertainty. But that perfect piece of advice usually doesn't exist. Life is not something you can fully figure out in theory. It's something you figure out in practice. You learn what kind of work you enjoy by actually working. You learn what kind of routines work for your body by trying them. You learn what kind of lifestyle makes you happy by living it. And sometimes the only way to get those answers is by experimenting and allowing yourself to make a few imperfect decisions along the way. The more you rely on outside voices to tell you what to do, the harder this becomes to trust your own judgment. And I think that's one of the hidden consequences of overconsuming advice. You slowly start outsourcing your decisions to the internet. Instead of asking yourself what feels right, you start asking, what would the internet say about this? Or what would this productivity expert recommend? But your life is not meant to be lived according to 1,000 different online opinions. At some point, you have to simplify things. You have to pick a direction, try it, learn from it, and trust that you can adjust along the way. Because the truth is, clarity rarely appears before action. Most of the time, clarity shows up after you start moving. Moving on to the third point, I want to talk about identity illusion. This is something that's a little bit more subtle, but I think it's one of the most interesting parts of this whole conversation. The identity illusion is the moment when consuming a lot of self-improvement content starts to make you feel like you are becoming a certain type of person, even though your actions haven't fully caught up yet. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you spend a lot of time around certain ideas, you start to mentally associate yourself with them. For example, if you listen to a lot of podcasts about business, entrepreneurship, and productivity, you start seeing yourself as someone who is very ambitious and focused on success. And if you watch a lot of fitness content, you start thinking of yourself as someone who's really into health and discipline. If you consume a lot of content about confidence, self-worth, and personal growth, you begin to identify with the idea of being a very self-aware and evolved person. And listen, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, being around positive ideas can absolutely influence your mindset in a good way. The problem starts when the identity forms faster than the behavior. Because listening to information can make you feel connected to a certain version of yourself without actually living like that person yet. It's kind of like someone who buys a lot of running gear and watches running videos and follows running influencers and talks about running all the time, but rarely actually goes for a run. Mentally, they feel like they're part of that world, but the real identity of being a runner only forms when you consistently go out and run, even on the days you don't feel like it. And I think this happens a lot in the self-improvement space. You might feel like you're a very disciplined person because you listen to a lot of productivity content, but discipline isn't really built through listening. thinking. It's built through doing things when you don't feel like doing them. You might feel like you're deeply working on your mindset because you consume a lot of motivational content, but mindset shifts really happen when you apply those ideas during difficult moments in your life. So identity at its core is shaped by behavior, not just by what you learn about it. So identity at its core is shaped by behavior, not just by what you learn about, but by what you actually do. And sometimes consuming a lot of content can blur that line a little bit. It creates a feeling of progress without the full reality of it yet. You might feel like you're already on the path to becoming that person, even though the daily actions that define that identity haven't fully taken root. So here's the encouraging part. The gap between identity and behavior can close very quickly once action enters the picture. Because the truth is, identities are not something you're born with, they're something you build. You become a writer by writing. You become confident by putting yourself in situations where you practice confidence. You become disciplined by repeatedly choosing discipline. And this is why doing, even in small ways, is so powerful. If you want to be someone who reads more, you don't need to consume more content about reading habits. You just need to read a few pages every day. If you want to become someone who's healthier, you don't need to spend hours researching fitness routines. You need to start moving your body consistently. And if you want to be more productive, you don't need to watch 20 videos about productivity systems. You just need to sit down and focus on the tasks that you've been avoiding. Action turns ideas into identity, and without action, ideas stay theoretical. And I think this is such an important realization because it shifts how we think about growth. Instead of trying to absorb as much information as possible about the person we want to become, we can focus on practicing small behaviors that align with that identity. Not perfectly and not all at once, but consistently enough that over time, those behaviors start to define who we are. Because at the end of the day, you don't become the person you want to be by thinking about it, learning about it, or consuming content about it. You become that person by living like them, even in small ways. And that shift from identifying with the idea of a person to actually behaving like that person is where the real transformation begins. Now, the fourth idea I want to talk about is something that took me a long time to really understand, and it's this. Most people believe they need clarity before they start something. But in reality, clarity usually comes after you begin. I know we touched on this earlier, but we're going to go in depth. I think a lot of us have this belief that we just need to have everything figured out before we take action. We want the perfect plan, the perfect routine, the perfect strategy. We want to know exactly what we're doing so that we can avoid making mistakes or wasting time. And honestly, that way of thinking sounds logical. It feels responsible to want clarity before committing your energy to something. But the truth is that in many areas of life, clarity doesn't show up while you're thinking about the decision. It shows up once you're actually in motion. Think about how often people delay starting something because they feel like they need more information. Like one of the perfect examples is starting a business. People spend months researching different ideas because they just want to find the perfect one. Starting is the hardest part. I get it. And on the surface, it can feel like preparation, but sometimes it becomes a way of postponing the uncomfortable part, which is simply beginning. The interesting thing is that the moment you actually start doing something, you begin to gather information that you could have never gained from research alone. Real experience gives you feedback that theory just simply cannot provide. You discover what parts of the process you enjoy and which parts drain your energy, and you learn about your own strengths, your own habits, your own discipline, and the areas where you might need to improve because everyone is different. No one starts off with the same skill set or the same personality or the same circumstances. Another good example is someone might spend months trying to decide what kind of career path they should pursue. They read articles, listen to advice, and compare options endlessly. But once they actually step into a job or a project, they suddenly start learning things about themselves that were impossible to know beforehand. They might realize they love the creative side of the work but dislike the structure. Or they might discover they enjoy solving problems more than managing people. Those insights don't come from thinking about the work. They come from doing the work. This is why action is so powerful. It shortens the distance between uncertainty and understanding. When you take action, even imperfect action, you create movement in your life. And that movement produces feedback. and that feedback leads to clarity. Without that movement, everything remains theoretical, and you can end up stuck in your head trying to solve problems that can only be answered through experience. I've also noticed that once people begin taking action, the fear that once felt so overwhelming often becomes much smaller. And I want you to listen carefully. When something only exists in your imagination, it can feel much bigger and more intimidating than it actually is. But once you start doing the thing, you realize that mistakes are manageable and that adjustments are possible and that progress still happens even when everything isn't perfect. So instead of waiting until you feel completely ready or completely certain, it can be helpful to flip the order. Rather than asking yourself, how can I get complete clarity before I begin? A better question might be, what small step can I take right now that will help me learn more about this? Because most of the time, the answers you're searching for are not waiting somewhere in another podcast episode or another article or another video. They're waiting on the other side of experience. And the only way to reach that experience is by taking the first step and allowing the path to reveal itself as you move forward. Clarity is rarely something you think your way into. More often, it's something that grows gradually as you take action and learn from what happens and continue adjusting along the way. Now, the final point I want to leave you with is something very simple, but also very practical, because at the end of the day, the goal of this conversation isn't to tell you that learning is bad or that you should stop consuming content altogether. Learning, again, is incredibly valuable. Podcasts, books, and videos, they can expose you to ideas that change the way you see the world, and they can introduce you to new perspectives and new tools and new possibilities. The problem only arises when consuming becomes the majority of what we're doing and execution becomes the minority. So, the mindset shift I want to leave you with is this. I want you to try to balance what you consume with what you execute. And so a simple way to think about it is something I like to call the 50-50 rule. For every amount of time you spend consuming information, try to spend a similar amount of time applying something you learned. Over time, you can play around with the percentage split, but 50-50 is a great way to start. For example, if you listen to a podcast episode about productivity for 30 minutes, ask yourself what action you can take in the next 30 minutes that moves your life forward. Maybe that means finally starting the task you've been putting off. Maybe it means organizing your schedule, writing down a plan for a project, or simply beginning something that you've been overthinking for a while. Or as I mentioned earlier, if you watch videos about fitness, instead of watching 5 more videos about the best workouts, you can take that moment to go for a walk or stretch or do a quick workout. If you read a chapter of a book about building better habits, you can spend a few minutes reflecting on which habit you want to start implementing immediately rather than just moving on to the next piece of information. The goal isn't perfection, the goal is translation. So taking ideas and turning them into behavior, because ideas by themselves don't really change our lives. Ideas are only powerful when they show up in our daily actions. And I think this is where a lot of people underestimate the power of small steps. Sometimes we imagine that change requires a huge dramatic move, and we think we need the perfect business plan or the perfect routine or the perfect circumstance before we start doing something meaningful. But in reality, most progress in life happens through small, consistent actions that compound over time. And once you begin doing more than consuming, your relationship with information will change. Instead of collecting ideas just for the sake of learning, you actually start listening differently. You start asking, how can I actually use this? The content you consume becomes more intentional because you're actively looking for things that can improve your real life, not just inspire you for just a moment. This also helps you filter what's worth your attention, because when you know you're going to apply what you learn, you naturally become more selective about the advice you follow. You're less interested in endless theories and more interested in ideas you can translate into action. And the beautiful thing about this shift is that it simplifies everything. You no longer feel like you need to consume every piece of advice that exists online, because that can be exhausting. You don't need to listen to 20 different opinions about how to live your life. Instead, you can focus on learning something, trying it, and seeing how it works for you, and then adjusting along the way. So if there's one takeaway I want you to remember from this episode, it's this. Self-improvement doesn't happen through consumption alone. It happens when knowledge meets action. Because the people who truly change their lives are not the ones who consume the most information, they're the ones who act on it. So I want you to take a moment to ask yourself one simple question. What is one thing I've been learning about that I can actually start doing today? It doesn't have to be something huge or life-changing overnight. Even the smallest step forward can create momentum, and momentum is often what leads to real progress. As always, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly, truly appreciate every single one of you who listens to this podcast and continues to support. And if you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it as well. And if you haven't already, leaving a quick review, once again, it really helps the podcast grow and reach more people. I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day. If you made it this far, I appreciate you so, so much. And I can't wait to chat with you again in next week's episode. Lots of love, Parmis.